Right, good morning, everyone. So this will be a vendor presentation in the style you've never seen before. So hopefully it's going to be engaging and give you some good ideas to take back to the office with you tomorrow. It's described as 4,000 kilometers to supply chain orchestration. And my name is Matthew Spooner, and I have two great passions in life. One of my passions is supply chain management. I work as an industry thought leader in Kinaxis, where I lead Kinaxis's, our investigation into what's happening in the future of supply chain management. And my other passion in life is ultracycling. And I'm going to be talking to you today about my second passion, about ultracycling, which you may seem a bit surprised about, but you're not half as surprised at the guys in the cycling conference I went to recently, where I told them I was going to be talking about supply chain management. Most people have heard of this race, and you probably believe that it's one of the greatest tests of sporting endurance around the world, where the world's best cyclists ride for 24 days to win the fabled yellow jersey. Unfortunately, I couldn't get 24 days off work. So no, I didn't take part in the Tour de France. Instead, I chose to do something much more difficult instead. I took part in the transcontinental race, which is a race that goes from Belgium to Greece. It's about the same distance as the Tour de France, or slightly longer, has about the same amount of elevation, but it's covered in half the amount of time, and it's totally unsupported. So there is no support cars, no rest stops. You just do it over a 13-day period. And when I initially started doing this, I thought that my background as a supply chain manager and a supply chain leader would put me in a really strong position for doing the transcontinental race. After all, I know, what it's like to live in to deal with uncertainty, to become resilient, and what it takes to go and, any of us who've worked in supply chain understand those challenges. And, and I thought that would really help me as I went through the transcontinental race. What I didn't realize was actually taking part in the transcontinental race would really help me to better understand supply chain management. And I kept on seeing parallels with the way that I was planning and executing the race, and the way that I plan and execute the supply chain, and the way that software like Kinaxis can actually be used to help you run supply chains more effectively. And people ask me, so what was I doing for all of these hours and hours that I was on the bike cycling across Europe? And people find it rather surprising when I say that actually I spent 185 hours on the bike. And for most of that time, I wasn't listening to music. I was actually thinking about supply chains. And when I wasn't thinking about supply chains, I was thinking about the weather. Success is achieved through clear goals, a clear plan, and the ability to be resilient. Now, we think about resilience, and we think that resilience is a capability. Actually, resilience is not a capability. Resilience is actually the outcome of different capabilities that we need to put together. To be resilient, we need to be agile. In order to be resilient, we need to have clear goals, a clear plan. In order to be resilient, we need to have a solution-driven mindset. We can't have a fixed mindset. And I realized that there were actually sort of three fundamental aspects that I want and that I'm going to focus on, where I think that there are huge overlaps between tackling an ultracycling race across Europe and running the supply chain. And I'm going to talk about these in a lot more detail. But in order to do any of these activities, or in order to run a supply chain, we need to be efficient, we need to be effective, and we need to be resilient. we need to have really clear goals, actually understand what is it that we want to achieve, and we need to have plans that support those goals in order to be efficient, effective, and resilient. We need to have a clear playbook to enable efficient execution in order to be efficient, effective, and resilient. And finally, I've been reading a lot of Gartner research about, and this word anti-fragility. And I finally got to understand what anti-fragility really means. It's beyond resilience. And I encourage anyone to read Gartner's research, written by one of their analysts called Tim Payne, around anti-fragility. I think it really does explain the next step from being resilient to becoming anti-fragile. So I'm going to start off with the planning and goal-setting process. A goal without plans is just a wish. And a plan without having any goals is worthless. And so the first thing that I set out when I set out on this cycling journey was actually to say, so what were my goals? But I actually needed to make sure that my goals were achievable. So the maximum amount of time, the cutoff time on this race is 15 days. So the first thing was to say, right, is it possible that I could go and complete this race within 15 days? I needed to make sure that I had those goals and set those goals. And so I did a number of things. I went I've been cycling for a long time, so I knew that my cycling fitness was pretty good. But I went for a ride over a long weekend in the Alps where I sort of covered 700 kilometers over a weekend, and that sort of ticked that box. I went and did on an indoor cycling, I did a 24-hour indoor cycling ride where I covered 800 kilometers, so that I knew that I could have the endurance. So I pretty much had a good idea that those goals were realistic. And I think it's really important within the supply chain that we set goals that are entirely realistic. If I look back to what happened in 2020 with COVID, and everyone talks about COVID and talks about that as a case study. When COVID happened, all of our goals got changed. I mean, we just couldn't, and I think businesses accepted that. But what we've seen is continued levels of disruption. We've seen the disruption in Ukraine. We're now seeing the disruption in the Middle East and the disruption in the Red Sea. We're seeing climate disruption in Panama Canal. Unfortunately, the companies are no longer saying, oh no, your goals are all changing. We actually now have to stick with the goals that we've been given. And actually, I think it's really important to ensure that those goals are realistic. If I talk about one of Kinaxis' customers, Teradyne, sorry, should I take a step back? So setting these goals, I think, should be the purpose of your IBP and S&OP process. Actually, I think this is one of the really missing steps within most organizations. What happens is that we have a demand plan, and we have a sales plan, and we have a marketing plan, and a consultant comes up to us and says, you need this IBP process where you go and force all of these functions to go and align these different plans and these different goals. It doesn't work. You end up typically with a finance plan superseding everything, and you try and make sure that you hit the finance plan, irrespective of whether you actually have to go and put in extra demand to go and achieve that finance plan. And so I think one of the purposes of the sales and operations planning process, and as Teradyne did, is to actually identify what can be done, what are realistic goals that you can achieve. 2 days ago, I was actually doing an interview for a US publication about what's happening in the cocoa market. I don't know if I know we've got some people from Barry Kleiber who are at the conference. I don't know if people are aware what's happening in the cocoa market, but due to the El Nino, the climate effect of El Nino, there's been incredibly bad weather in the west coast of Africa, which has really impacted the cocoa crop. There's been a disease which has been ravaging the cocoa crop for the last 5 years, And also, the war in the Ukraine has meant that there's been a reduction in the amount of fertilizer which can be sent over to the West Coast, which is also reducing the yield of the cocoa crop. So there's and cocoa has gone up by 200% over the last 3 years. There's been a 3-year increase in cocoa prices. So an organization they can have corporate goals to say, yep, we want to go and supply this market. But if there isn't the supply there, they actually have to go and say, right, so these are the goals that we're going to achieve. Given the constraints we've got, these are the goals that we're going to achieve. We're going to align on those goals and make sure those goals are properly reflected as part of the S&OP process. And so Teradyne, who is, as I say, is one of Kinaxis' customers, what they use Kinaxis to collaborate, rather than having multiple plans, around a single set of numbers, with all of the functions coming together. Another customer of ours, Technicolor, also use what they call rapid response, Kinaxis' solution, as a policing system to ensure, before marketing would be putting in place big marketing plans, which would then go and drive a load of inventory, and the supply chain would take the consequence of that inventory. And it's actually about that, getting that collaboration, that cross-setting of goals in a consistent way. Now, after I'd gone and set my goals, what I needed to do was to create a plan. And this is where the planning system comes in place. So I used a software called Komoot, which is fairly widely used in the cycling sort of market. It uses a lot of AI and a lot of route planning capability to identify what would be the best route. And very rapidly, it can generate a plan which is about 80% accurate. But it ignores some factors, like does the route that it plans, it might say the optimum route goes through a very mountainous region, because that just happens to be the fastest route. But if I've got to ride the next day, I've got to think about the fatigue that that's going to go and create. So I might want to go and look at different options about replanning that. Or I might want to make sure that I've got a route that has a lot of shops on it, or a lot of hotels where I can go and stay. So it's about getting that 80% plan done correctly first time, but then look at how do you add the value as a planner to say, right, well, actually, I know that that's a good starting point, but I really want to add value. And I think that's, again, another thing that we're seeing. The planning tools don't replace your planners. We've seen this idea of lights-off planning. I don't believe in it. What I believe that the modern planning solutions do is automate a lot of the creating of these Excel spreadsheets that just take long time to go and put together. They're not really value-adding. Your planners can really add value in that last 20% of the planning process. So having done that and created my plan in Komoot, I then used another system called Best Bike Split, which uses machine learning. So I loaded into Best Bike Split probably 2 years of my ride history, and it looks at how fast do I ride in certain conditions, on certain road conditions, and it could take my plan, and then it would break my plan down into a number of different chunks. So I then had a plan that I believed was a realistic plan of how far I could go each day, and that exercise identified that I could complete this route within 12 days. So yes, it achieved my goal. And again, I think this is another aspect where we can really learn in the supply chain, is actually taking all of that external data. What is our past performance? Prior to being in Kinaxis, I spent a number of years in Gartner, where I led Gartner's research around sales and operations planning. And we all talk about sort of supply chain maturity, and we know that companies like P&G and Unilever have been right up at the top of that supply chain maturity. When I worked as the head of supply chain in ABB after working in Gartner, ABB didn't have the level of maturity of a P&G and Unilever. They couldn't perform at that same level. And that's why I think you need to all of the goals, all of the plan needs to be grounded in reality, not grounded in aspiration. If I said, I want to do this route and be in the same time as the world champion,
That's just completely unrealistic. The next part is around how do I plan for uncertainty and risk without overdoing it? And I actually saw a really good question on LinkedIn from somebody who asked a question about how do I know when I'm overdoing the risk management? Now, the way that I looked, so what you can see there is all of the items that I took. So you might see that this is a collection of bits and pieces that I packed. Actually, I took a risk management approach. So every single item that I packed, I was saying, by taking this item, what risk am I mitigating? And if I couldn't say that I was mitigating, if that item wasn't mitigating a risk, then I wouldn't take it. The idea was to try and come up with a compromise. A good example of this is, I was going to be cycling through the mountains, and it gets cold in the mountains at night, even in the middle of summer. And so I could say, well, you need to take lots of cold weather equipment. But actually, the most effective way of managing the cold is to have a hat and a really good pair of gloves. And that will take the worst of the cold off, and that's very, very light. I won't say that when I cycled down the Forca de Livigno in the snow at 1 o'clock in the morning that I was warm or comfortable, but it was enough. I had enough to be able to overcome that risk and mitigate that risk. And I think what we're seeing in the supply chain, post-COVID, post all the supply chain disruptions, a lot of organizations have overdone the risk management. They've put in too much inventory level, and now they're suffering the consequences of holding too much stock, the cost of capital, particularly as interest rates have gone up, the cost of obsolescence of holding that risk. So what I would really advise organizations is that when you're looking at risk, when you're looking at the supply chain, don't necessarily think of your demand plan as a demand plan, or your supply plan or your inventory plan as a supply plan or an inventory plan. Your demand plan is a way of minimizing customer risk or demand risk from your customers. Supply plan is a way of minimizing supply risk from your suppliers. Your inventory is another risk management tool. Jabil put in place and we did a lot of work with Jabil to put in place a command and control center, particularly in order to minimize risk, to minimize costs, and to maximize customer service. But actually that they took a risk management approach when they were looking at a control tower. There's also a great tendency to overplan. Now, I could have, in an ideal world, I could have said that I'm going to plan my route, and I'm going to plan where I'm going to stop, the hotel I'm going to stop in every night. It would have probably saved me a lot of money because you can do that up front. The trouble was, even though I had a good plan, it wasn't sufficiently good that I could say I can definitely get to that hotel every day. Maybe I'll get to that hotel early and I've missed the opportunity of cycling 2 hours. Or maybe that hotel is just too far away and I'm going to push myself too much to get to that hotel overnight. And I think there's a huge tendency to overplan in the supply chain. And overplanning shackles us to sticking with a bad plan. We feel, right, we've created this plan, but now we need to really stick to this. Actually, you do need to have the agility. You need to have flexibility in your plan. So when I was looking at hotels, I made sure that my route passed areas where there were lots of lodging options, so that I had a pretty good idea that I would be able to get a hotel every night. And actually, there was only one night where I didn't manage to find a hotel, and I actually had to sleep in a chapel, actually, which in Greece, which wasn't too bad at all. And I think Procter & Gamble are one of the best organizations at how they manage this balance between being specific and creating a plan that's good enough and making sure that they have enough flexibility and they don't overplan their supply chains. And this, I think, is a very typical of high-performing, high-maturity organizations, is not to overplan. And a lot of low-maturity organizations overplan, and then they find that that plan is unachievable. So the second part that I'm going to talk about is about having a clear playbook to enable effective execution. when I had, when I set out on this, so I had a number of clear rules, because and I knew right at the beginning that it didn't matter what would happen. There would be, events would happen that would mean that I wouldn't be able to follow my plan. I didn't know what those events were, but I could develop strategies for how was I going to deal with different events. I could have a very clear playbook. I was actually speaking to a good friend of mine who I've known for many years at New Ways, Jeremy Baskin. He was talking about you've got your static plan, which is your S&OP plan, which is looking at your tactical time horizon. And you've got your active plan, which is the plan that you need to adjust on a day-to-day basis. And I think having that playbook, telling you how to create those adjustments, is really important. So when I look at the type of strategies I put in place, there's actually a really good film on Netflix called Inside the Transcontinental Race that was made in 2020. And it was based on the 2019 Transcontinental Race. And if you watch that film, you'll see they followed a group of riders, and that group of riders got progressively crazier as the race went on. You could see that they were falling apart, they were becoming irrational, they were making really irrational decisions. And I saw that and I thought, that's not the way that I want to do this. Okay? So one of my first things I said in my playbook is, right, I'm not going to... So ultra cyclists, there's this big thing that you go and have your bivy bag and you cycle until you fall asleep, and then you sort of put your bag beside the road and you sleep for 3 hours and then you carry on, and what happens is you get more and more exhausted. I said, right, I'm going to stay in a hotel every single night. And that was one of my clear rules on my playbook. Another one was I was going to sit down for 3 meals per day. Make sure that I was just getting, even though I could stop and get gas station sandwiches, and that might have been, faster to do that, I wouldn't be getting the nutrition and the recovery that I was putting in place. A really famous ultra runner, probably the world's most famous ultra runner, Kilian Jornet, and I took a lot of inspiration from him, described about how he thinks ahead at different scenarios and thinks about what's his decision-making framework, and how do you break your decisions down into really simple yes/no answers. Rather than trying to make complex decisions when you're tired, actually try and simplify those decisions as much as possible. Merck, or MSD, is another Kinaxis customer. Prior to implementing Kinaxis and Rapid Response, they had multiple different systems that were all connected together with Excel spreadsheets. And they didn't really have a playbook about how were they connected. The big value that they got from implementing the tool wasn't the optimization and the algorithms. It was the fact that they went from a set of disparate, disconnected systems connected by emails and Excel to a connected system that they could actually collaborate around a single set of numbers. And it actually changed the way, and they changed their their way of working based on the implementation of the tool. So the tool was just an enabler of the new process. And scenarios were a really important part of my playbook. So this is actually one of the scenarios I planned ahead of time. And again, this is part of should be part of the S&OP process. The direct route that Kamut suggested from Slovenia, went through Bosnia and into Montenegro. Now, I was a little bit concerned about that because, well, firstly, it was in the middle of a heat wave in Europe, and so I thought, well, if I go inland, is that going to be a little bit too hot? And secondly, I knew that Croatia has very good cycling infrastructure. It's become a destination for cycling vacations. So on paper, it should have been about 6 hours slower going through Croatia. I planned these 2 scenarios, and I said, right, when I get to this point in Slovenia, well, it's just up at the top, I will make a decision. Do I go based on the weather forecast and based on a number of different criteria? Do I take my route that I planned through Bosnia, or do I take the route that I planned through Croatia? When I got there, I saw that there were really bad thunderstorms in Bosnia. And so I decided to go take the route down through Croatia. So even though this route should have taken 6 hours longer, I actually overtook 25 people by doing this route, and it took me 10 hours less than all the people who went through Bosnia. You can't, it's looking at, and when we look at the supply chain, we should look at different options. Everyone knows about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Panama Canal, not the Suez Canal at the moment. Now, the Panama Canal, and I wrote about this in April last year, it was apparent that the water levels in the Panama Canal were getting very low in April last year. And also, I looked back over history and I saw that the last time that we had El Nino, the Panama Canal also experienced water shortages. And so I wrote about this. I said that, in October or November, we should be a little bit concerned about what's going to happen in the Panama Canal, because last time we had El Nino, it was, it started running dry, and it's looking like the El Nino might be particularly powerful this year. So, and the water levels are already lower than it should be. And then it went into the wet season, I think in June, and people stopped writing and stopped talking about the Panama Canal, except it turned out that it was a damp season, not a wet season. And so my prediction was wrong. The Panama Canal didn't start restricting shipping in October, November. It started restricting shipping in September, and it's still restricting shipping. Now, that should have been apparent at that time as supply chain leaders, that we should have planned a scenario to say, what happens if the Panama Canal starts restricting shipping in October? That was a scenario that would be entirely plannable. What we're all focusing on, though, at the moment is not many organizations did that. And now they're saying, oh, yeah, but we've got these wonderful systems, and we're using people like Transporia and Fourkites and planning systems like Kinaxis to put that agility in now that the Panama Canal's is restricted. Well, we should have been planning ahead of time. You don't need advanced planning systems to do that. You just need to be able to look at these different scenarios. Dr. Reddy's laboratories use Kinaxis actually to plan different scenarios when they're doing product launch. And they look at different different criteria and have different decision criteria, different scenarios based on hitting certain targets as you come up to a product launch. And again, that's another example about planning ahead, having these scenarios that you put in your bottom drawer. And linked to this is actually having a digital twin. Now, this is actually a picture of the front of my bike. I actually operated with a digital twin. I had a GPS system, a Garmin system that was providing the navigation, which was based on my plan. But I also had my planning software, Komoot, running on my phone, that would allow me to replan in real time, as events came up. So and that's very much what we would describe as a digital twin. So you've got your actual plan, and then in real time. And so if something happened, if something happened, it allowed me to go and replan my route, and then immediately transfer that onto my live route. That took me about sort of 2 or 3 minutes to be able to do that, to create these mini scenarios in a digital twin. And that's very much how Johnson Electric actually did a case study with Kinaxis, and they described about how having this capability, this digital twin, how it allows their organization, their planners to work together to create mini scenarios in real time, evaluate those mini scenarios, then decide and bring those scenarios up into their live system. So it very much empowers the planners. And what you've got here is actually 2 roads in Albania, two highways, I should say, in Albania. Now, the system and the AI knows that both of these roads are gravel roads. However, you've got gravel and gravel. The gravel on the left is entirely rideable. The gravel road on the right is a little bit more extreme. Now, what happened when I was sort of faced with these type of choices would actually be able to use the digital twin to say, I need to go and replan this route. Is there an alternative that will mean that I avoid that road on the right? Or if it looks like the road on the left, then I can go and deal with that. And I think that's very much the case we have in supply chains. Master data doesn't tell us if the course on the left or the right is going to be better. But resilience is sometimes not enough. Now, this was on day 10 of the transcontinental race, and I was already having a really bad day. I'd cycled 300 kilometers, I'd climbed about 4,000 meters, and I'd missed dinner. And there was a set parcours, so this was a set piece of the course where you had to ride, and we had two options on the set parcours. One was to ride an 80-kilometer loop, which had about 2,500 meters of extra climbing, or the other was to do a hike over a mountain, which was about 25 kilometers and 1,000 meters of extra climbing, but was probably not going to be rideable. Now, I'd already made the decision that I was going to go and do the road route, because that's what I was equipped to do. It might take longer, but it was a sensible choice. But I ignored my playbook when it came to it, and I decided, no, actually, I'm going to go and hike over this mountain. And it was about 9 o'clock at night, and as I said, I'd missed dinner. And it was actually pretty good at the beginning. The first 7 kilometers I was thinking, yeah, this is the right decision. It's going okay. And then a disaster struck. My rear derailleur, which is a really important part of the bike's drivetrain, caught a rock, and it snapped the rear derailleur entirely. So there I was, 18 kilometers away from the nearest civilization at all, with a bike that was totally inoperable. I thought, okay, yeah, that's it, my race is completely over. But then I sort of sat back and thought, okay, so what can I do? So I thought, right, okay, well, I'll carry on, and I'll hike over to the next town, and we'll see what I can do. I got over to the next town at 1:30 in the morning. This is in Greece, in rural Greece, and this little village called Theodoriana, thinking, I'm probably going to have to sleep outside tonight. I got there, there was a wedding in full swing. It was like party town at 1:30 in the morning. The local restaurant was still open. They gave me dinner. They gave me food for the night. They then introduced me to the local farmer who could take me down to the nearest town, which was 100 kilometers away. And he would take me there at 6 o'clock the following morning. And so suddenly I was thinking, okay, well, maybe it's not completely disastrous. So 6 o'clock in the morning, I got taken to the town. My bike was repaired and by lunchtime, and then I had to cycle, because of the rules of the race. Having repaired my bike, I then had to cycle 100 kilometers back to Theodoriana, up 2,000 meter climb. And the strange thing was, I felt completely elated. I felt utterly lifted. I should have been feeling completely depressed. And I was thinking, why is it? And I realized it's because I had overcome what I thought was a challenge that would be impossible to overcome. And I think when I speak to organizations about dealing with the disruptions, when you deal with the disruptions that we're seeing, when you work out these strategies, you don't just resilient, you don't just go back to where you were before. As a team, you actually become stronger, even though things haven't gone necessarily particularly well. And that's where what I really believe is the source of anti-fragility. So when things wrong, it's about having that really open mindset, saying, right, so what can I do that will, to fix the solution? What resources do I actually have available? What different options? And putting all of those in place, asking for help and growing from that help, that can really be empowering. And it's interesting, because I talked to one of the supply chain leaders in P&G in the US, and P&G described this again is very much the mindset in P&G. It's like we don't get knocked by failure. We try and learn from that failure and try and grow from that failure. So in Albania, I was riding on the SH-36. The SH-36 is a highway in Albania. It's described as one of Europe's most dangerous roads. It's an old trading route, high alpine pass, The road is terrible. There are no safety barriers. It has 400-meter drops in different places and giant potholes. Anyway, so I was on the SH36, and as I was coming towards the end, I heard a really loud noise ahead, and I was thinking, is this an animal, because there are bears in this area, or is this a person? And as I approached, it became apparent that it was definitely a person. So I was thinking, okay, so is this a person that I want to avoid, or is this somebody who's in real distress? And then as I got a bit closer, I saw a rear light, and so I thought, okay, so it's another competitor on the race. And he was like really, really distressed. I think, what has happened? So I got up to it, and I got up to this unfortunate Frenchman, and I asked him if he needed help, and actually he was sobbing. He told me his story. In ultra cycling, there's this big thing about you want your bike to be as reliable as possible, and we want to have cable-operated brakes, whereas a lot of if there are any mountain bikers here, everyone knows that the much better brakes are hydraulic brakes. But he'd gone with this this myth that you want to have these cable-operated brakes, and the riding on this road was so extreme that he was actually unable to operate his brakes anymore. He had so much fatigue in his arms that he just couldn't, and he was screaming in pain, and he'd fallen off his bike multiple times because he couldn't. I encouraged him for a bit, and he got and helped him get down to the bottom, and then he gave up from the race. And actually another competitor I came across had a similar experience, except he decided to continue, but the first bike shop he came to, he asked them to swap out his entire braking system. Sometimes, and if I put this back into the context of supply chain, sometimes we continue with the processes that we're used to, or people tell us that we should be following, even though they're totally outdated. And we become like this Frenchman on his bike, who, with a few simple changes, he could have become much more resilient, but it absolutely destroyed him. And we need to question, what's the technology? What are the processes that we need, that we're using? And challenge that all the time, rather than just be stuck in our ways and stuck in the ways that it's just the way that it's done, and it's the way other organizations do it. Now, there was a slightly sad ending to this, that about 3 months after the race, I actually got a message to say that I'd been disqualified, which came as a bit of a shock to me, as I didn't realize that I'd done anything wrong. And then I sort of went and investigated. In Albania, so everything happened in Albania, but in Albania, when I was riding through there, I missed a turning, one of the turnings, and my Garmin device rerouted me, because it uses AI, it rerouted me onto a road, which I didn't realize was a banned road. I wasn't, for some reason, I hadn't been using my digital twin at the time. If I'd actually validated that route, that rerouting, I would have seen immediately that it went on a banned road. But I just followed the way that the system told me to follow. And I think this, unfortunately, is one of the pitfalls of technology, and particularly one of the pitfalls of AI. Sometimes we just believe that the system, we believe that it's correct, and we automatically follow it. And in this case, there was an issue with master data. The data that was feeding the Garmin system was actually incorrect. And so it led me onto a road that technically I wasn't allowed to cycle on. One of the leading organizations in the world looks at at AI with a view about, and they categorize the use of AI in a really nice way. They talk about AI being in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop. AI in the loop is where AI is used as a decision support tool, but a person is accountable for using that, and that's used for mission critical decisions, or where the consequence of that decision could be very high. Decision on the loop is where the system makes the decision, but a person always validates that decision is correct. So there's always oversight of that decision. And then there's AI out of the loop, where where AI is trained to make the decision, and AI then can make the decision entirely autonomously. Those are typically used for routine type decisions where the consequence of that decision being wrong is not significant. And I think when you're looking at your AI journey, think about this and think about what's your governance structure for AI, because you don't want to have the same situation as me where I actually essentially used AI out of the loop. I didn't validate that decision, and as a result, it had a fairly big consequence on my race. So it transpires that doing a 4,000-kilometer ultra race is remarkably similar to the capabilities that are used for running a supply chain. Technology has revolutionized ultra cycling. A few years ago, we couldn't safely do this type of event, this type of race going across Europe. We couldn't be able to find all the information about hotels and food stops. If I'd been trying to do this with maps, yes, maybe I wouldn't have been disqualified, but I would probably still be in Albania today trying to find my way to Greece. And it's the same in supply chain. We've moved beyond, trying to operate in an analog world of the supply chain. And the technology is a great enabler, as long as we're just aware of some of those pitfalls of that technology. We need to have clear playbooks. We can't rely on the technology to make all of the decisions for us, or we can't rely on the technology to dictate what our processes should be. We need to look at technology and processes in conjunction and identify, well, what is our playbook? And also, the final one is that when the unexpected happens, the anti-fragile, people who have anti-fragile supply chains will recover stronger. And I think that's a really important lesson. So I think I've got maybe couple of minutes left for any questions. Yes.
Really interesting conversation and presentation. Thank you. Did you put any element of fun into it as well? Because I guess there's a bit of personal mindset in this that I like the anti-fragile. I hadn't heard that before, but I relate to it completely. But
Yeah,
your mind state as well as a leader within it to create something that inspired you. And I think the little bit about adversity and then overcoming, where you relate to feeling elated. Did you actively at some point say, well, I'm going to take that because actually I'm going to get real personal motivation from it in any of your decision making?
I thought when I was doing my research to start this, I thought, I'm going to have some really good times and some really low points. I had no low points. I had so much fun for 2 weeks doing this. I think a big part of it was because I was getting 6 hours sleep every night, and that was a really important part of it. And I was surprised actually about how much fun I had on the. I think the only low point was when I broke the rear derailleur, and even then, the elation from recovering from that, and that was about 2 days from the end. The last 2 days, I probably had better performance than at any point because I just had that huge, that endorphin high that lasted 2 days. Any other questions? Yes.
How would you advise to breed an anti-fragile mentality within a team?
Yeah, so there's no one really simple answer, okay? The first thing I think with having an anti-fragile, breeding anti-fragility into a team is I think it's about coaching around having an open mindset as opposed to having a fixed mindset. And making sure, and there are techniques that can be used to create that open mindset. Having really clear goals and understanding and going right back to my starting point, actually understanding what those goals are. Start with your goals, not start with where you are today. Because if you start with where you are today, you're constrained by the limitations of today. That doesn't mean that you're setting completely unrealistic goals. I'm never going to be the world champion cyclist. I'm never going to be able to compete with the people in the Tour de France, so there'd be no point in me setting those goals. But I think setting realistic goals and then saying, okay, where am I today? And then identifying what are the different points on that journey going forward. And so when a disruption happens, if you know what those goals are, you can then step back and say, right, firstly, do I have to reevaluate my goals? So I knew straight away that I wouldn't be able to finish in 12 days, but I would still be able to finish within the cutoff of 15 days. So I reset my goals and then replotted the route through. So I think that there's techniques that you need to learn about how to put that and also for people not to be afraid of failure. I spent my whole career as in supply chain, and I'm guessing most of you are the same. How many of you know that you've made bad decisions that have cost the organization huge amounts of money? I certainly have. The thing is, I've made far more good decisions than I've made bad decisions. And you mustn't dwell on those failures. Remember the 80% of the time where you got it right. And so I think it's things like that you need to try and instill in the organization.
You had a very organised kit list there. Interested in which item would you leave behind next time and which item would you add? And an equivalent, what would you do from a supply chain and logistics perspective? What thing do you think we should throw out and what do you think we should be adding?
Okay, I can do that from my kit list. That would be... So, I'm actually going to do the race again, and the one change that I'm making to my kit list is that I'm putting a dropper post on my bike so that I can lower the saddle on the gravel sections, because that created so much, and everyone's telling me I'm mad to do that. Because again, you just don't do that in the ultra cycling world. But I'm a mountain biker as well. I know that a dropper post will make a big difference. What's the item that I would leave out? I would take all of my outdoor sleeping kit, even though I didn't use it, because you need to have that for eventualities. I think that I took 2 Garmin head units and two phones, which I think was overkill. What I would take 2 phones, because if a phone if you lose a phone, then that's a disaster. But I would only take 1 GPS unit, because I can always repurpose a phone to be a GPS unit. Now, in the supply chain, what would I leave? What would I leave out? I think that we use inventory as our primary buffer against to create resilience, and it's like the way I described. I could take a hat and a gloves for dealing with cold weather. The analogy I would have in supply chain, with the amount of inventory that we're carrying, we've got hat, gloves, base layer, warm jacket, and it's really increasing reducing the agility in our supply chain. You actually heard from FutureMaster this morning talking about the bullwhip effect. All that inventory is actually increasing the bullwhip effect. So I would absolutely take inventory out of or not all of it, but I would really sort of start looking at the way that the purpose of inventory within the supply chain. What's the thing that I would think that what we should be doing in supply chain, and is far more connection between the way that we execute the supply chain and the way that we plan the supply chain. We plan supply chains, and then that's thrown over to execution. Things happen, and what we're actually executing is very different to what the way that we're our supply chain plans, and they become completely misaligned. So if you use the example of what's happening in the Red Sea at the moment, I might have and we know that container times, shipping times have gone up as companies are avoiding going through Suez Canal. A lot of organizations are, looking at this and say, oh, I've got a container in China. I need to go and fly that entire container over to Europe because, I don't know, we've got some items in there that we absolutely need to fulfill an urgent demand. Whereas I think that if we can start identifying, well, we know that we've got 2 items in this container, which we can take out of the container and then fly those over. We can then maybe manage the expectation of our customers to say, oh, actually, because of Suez, this situation, we're going to be 2 days late shipping all of this. You can then start, running a compromise between, and then having done that, updating the plan so that the plan now reflects reality. So it's a bit of a long answer, but okay. I think we're out of time. I think other people have got meetings now, but thank you very much for coming, and hope you enjoyed that.